let me once again officially welcome everybody to today's online event, Parole Violations and Revocations, Evidence-Based Responses to California in Crisis. Today's event is sponsored by the National Institute of Justice and the Government Innovators Network. I'd like to pass things off to today's moderator, Jeremy Travis, who is the president of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Mr. Travis.
Thank you very much, Jim, and welcome to everybody who's participating in this web conference, and a particular welcome to my fellow panelists, whom I'll introduce in a moment. But let me just extend our thanks on behalf of all 154 people on the web conference at the moment to the Ash Institute for Governance and Innovation at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and a particular thanks to the National Institute of Justice, both for sponsoring this web conference and for sponsoring the research that we will be discussing here today. This is an important topic that I think is the importance is evidenced by the wonderful turnout that we've had in this country, indeed from other countries, to the invitation to join this conference. I'm going to take give you a sense of the opening event, and then spend some time setting the conversation in larger context. We will be hearing from a very distinguished group of panelists in a moment, and they have presentations that will appear in PowerPoint on your screen. The presentations by the panel will last about a half hour or so, and we encourage people, as they're hearing the presentations, to post questions, and certainly after the presentations are all over, to post their questions so that we can have a very lively and hopefully productive conversation after the presentation, so that we can really move the conversation and develop some useful insights that will be valuable to those who are practitioners in the field or researchers doing research on this topic. So let me just take a moment, if I might, to step back from the presentation and try to set the topic in some larger context. So I think it's well known to everybody on this call, certainly, that there's been a significant increase in incarceration in this country over the last generation. And what is of particular interest to us today is the increase in both the phenomenon of parole supervision, i.e., more people being placed on parole supervision as they leave prison than at earlier times in our history. But drilling down one level deeper, we're particularly interested in the interactions between people on parole and those who are supervising their parole, when those interactions lead to violations of parole, and particularly revocations of parole and a return to prison. To put that phenomenon in context, I'd ask the participants in the conference just to consider these comparative facts. We've had approximately a four-fold increase in the rate of incarceration in this country over the past 30 years, but we've had a seven-fold increase in the number of parole revocations. So many more people on supervision, being supervised now in ways that are different from what supervision looked like in the past, more use of technology, more focus on surveillance, a de-emphasis of supervision, a sort of a tighter, more sort of enforcement or form of oversight than we might have seen 30 years ago, and a shift in the public mood that perhaps is shifting back now, but certainly over that 30-year period of time towards a risk aversion and a concern about being tough on crime and tough on criminals, and that certainly includes parolees. So the phenomenon that we're discussing today, which is parole violations and revocations, is something that lies right at the heart of the national experiment in significantly increased incarceration. If we understand this phenomenon in its implications, I want to just suggest that there are perhaps four implications that are important. One is that the increase in violations and revocations and returns to prison has contributed to, and in some ways been the leading indicator in a phenomenon called by my colleague here, John J. Todd Clear, called churning. A large number of individuals, mostly in a small number of communities of color in our country, are now being arrested, sent to prison, returned, supervised closely, parole, revoked, returned to prison for short stays. A phenomenon of churning at the community level that has consequences that we certainly don't fully understand. A second sort of effect of this phenomenon has been this has contributed to a growth in prison population, sending more people back to prison through what's called back-end sentencing, or back to the prison system, has contributed to growth of prison population. And nowhere is that more true than California, which we'll hear about in a second. A third consequence that I think we should keep in mind is that this high level of parole revocations has consequences for correctional programming, for the processes of admitting people back to prison, trying to determine what is an appropriate program or programs for somebody who's by definition going to be in prison for a relatively short period of time. So state prisons in this way come to look more like jails, having people in and out, a different type of churning for these short stays. And a final consequence just to keep in mind here as we consider the importance of this topic is that to the extent that our increased reliance on prison as a response to crime has contributed to a disaffection between the citizens, and particularly citizens in urban America and urban communities of color, disaffection between them and the criminal justice system. I think we have to ask what are the consequences of significantly increased use of parole violations or revocations for that phenomenon. So,
Mr. Travis, I'm sorry, this is Jim Cooney. I just wanted to break in for just a moment and ask two requests. One is for you, if you could speak a little bit louder. We've had just a few attendees having trouble hearing you. And then for the other presenters, we're getting some background noise. Make sure you mute your phones if you're not speaking.
Okay. I will try to speak louder, and let me know if this is not successful. So we know remarkably little about the phenomenon of parole violations and revocations, which brings us to the study that we're discussing today. We don't know much about how these decisions are made. We don't know much about the reasons. We don't know much about the impact of parole violations and revocations upon public safety. We know little about the effectiveness of various types of supervision and alternatives to this form of sanctioning of misconduct. We know that from studies done by Joan Petersilia, who's on our call today, and her colleagues at RAND, that intensive supervision leads to a much higher rate of revocation, but does not produce reductions in recidivism. We know from a study published 2 years ago by the Urban Institute that supervision itself, comparing those supervised to those not supervised, seems to have very little effect on recidivism rates. So there's reasons to be very concerned and to have a sort of a focus on this phenomenon in the criminal justice field. Fortunately, we have new national attention. National Institute of Corrections is doing very, very productive work in this area. American Probation Parole Association, Center for Effective Public Policy, represented here by Peggy Burke, has done good work in this area. Some states are paying attention. Sentencing commissions are doing important research. And people who write about the topic are focusing on it. There's a very important conference at Stanford Law School recently on back-end sentencing. So this is a very good time for us to be having this conversation. And we are very fortunate that we have, as our presenters on the panel, experts who can help us shed some light on the national phenomenon and using California and a very important study that's just been completed as our jumping off point. So I'll introduce the panel and ask each of them to spend bit of time talking about their perspective on the topic, and then we'll open it up for conversations. Our first presenter will be Dr. Joan Petersilia, who's recently moved from University of California, Irvine, on her way to Stanford Law School. Dr. Petersilia, as anybody in this field knows, is the preeminent academic researcher on parole supervision, and prisoner reentry, and we're very fortunate to have her here, and she was a co-PI of the study that will be discussed today. We'll then hear from Ryken Grattet, who's a colleague of Joan's on the California study. He's at the University of California at Davis in their sociology department, and has done really groundbreaking work on this topic in this field. We'll then next hear from Tom Hoffman, who represents the adult parole division for the state of California within their Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, who's been a collaborator on this study and will help us understand the practical implications of the research. And then finally, taking a step back from the California research, we will hear from Peggy Burke. Peggy is also one of those, unfortunately, small number of experts, a very highly respected expert on parole supervision and the parole policies generally. She's a principal at the Center for Effective Public Policy and has done work in probably, I'd say, virtually every state in the country, and we're very fortunate to have her as well. I will come back to be moderator as we get the questions, but I'll turn it now over to Joan Petersilia.
Thank you, Jeremy. And again, let me welcome the attendees, and again also thank the National Institute of Justice for funding this study and also putting on this webinar. All of us who work in the research area don't want our studies just sitting on the shelves, and this is another way in which we can translate the results of this study in particular today to those of you in the field that we hope will find our research useful. This study, for me, if you'll show the first chart, I'll do it myself, I guess, is particularly something that I care very much about because, as Jeremy mentioned, I have been thinking about community supervision and parole violations for probably the last 25 years. But it's been growing in the interest of others outside of the research community. As Jeremy mentioned, it's now a hot topic, I think, in state after state. 5 years ago, my colleague and I, Ryken Grattet, started getting quite interested in the role of technical violations in contributing to the crisis that was starting to emerge in 2003, 2004 here in California. This study, while you'll see that it was quite rigorous, I think it really is the best study on parole violations. It was actually motivated by a very practical concern. It was motivated by the situation that was happening in California prisons, which were overcrowded. You'll see the picture here of males and females, of large dormitories, smaller triple cell, and in every aspect, California's prison was widely viewed as being in crisis when we started to think about what we might do as academics interested in public policy and corrections might contribute to this emerging crisis. In 2003, 2004, the issue became front and center here in California, where our governor announced that California prison system was now in a state of emergency. You'll see the four pictures that I presented here for you. One is the governor saying that what was going on in California prisons, our officers were threatened, we had the highest recidivism rate in the country, there were few programs, and we faced the possibility of a court-ordered early release of felons. On the right, you have Mike Jimenez, who is the president of our California Prison Guard Union. And he was saying in his 20 years as a correctional officer, he had never seen a situation and the conditions quite as oppressive as they were at that time, which was a quote from 2004. You have Jim Tilton, who ran the prison system at the time, saying, I'm now out of beds. And you have the court saying, time is over, and telling the Schwarzenegger administration that you have basically 6 months to ease overcrowding, or I, in fact, will order early releases. The court turned around, appointed Robert Soen as a former court-ordered receiver who was supposed to help ease the crowding because it was threatening inmate medical care. And he told the state, quote, he will back up the truck to raid the state treasury if the state did not figure out some way to bring our system out of emergency, out of crisis, and into constitutional compliance. That was the situation we faced in 2003, 2004, when my colleague Ryken and I thought that there was something that we could do as academics to help the situation, and particularly we were focused on parole. Now, the reason we were focused on parole, and the reason we were focused on California, and why this story that we're going to tell you today really isn't about California. California, it's just magnified, but the trends that we see in California, in fact, are happening in state after state. As you no doubt know of some of the attendees, we see that what states you're representing. But California is instructive because so goes California, so goes the nation. We have the largest prison system in the United States. We actually in California have 1 out of every 8 U.S. prisoners. We're now at an all-time high, although we've actually declined slightly in the last few months. We now have 171,000 prisoners. But our prison population is the largest in the United States. 56,000 employees work at the California Department of Correction and Rehabilitation, 1 out of 6 of all state employees. We have a $10 billion budget that's rapidly increasing. And in fact, when I produced this slide, which was in 2008, the actual number was $43,000 per inmate. About 2 weeks ago, the Department of Corrections released new figures showing that increase has now increased to $49,000 a year per inmate per year to house somebody in the California Department of Corrections. And we are widely viewed as the most crowded system in the nation at 200% over capacity, of single-cell capacity. Now, what's the problem? Why are we in a state of emergency? There's some uniquenesses that relate to the topic here today. One is that unlike other states, and in fact every other state, nearly all California prisoners released, they virtually are all released, as Jeremy wrote a book and so aptly titled it, But They All Come Home. That is similar here in California. About 95% of all prisoners will eventually be released. And what is unique in California is that all of them, virtually all of them, go on formal parole supervision. The national rate is about 40%. So if you think about 100% of all parolees going on parole here in California for a minimum of 1 year and a normal time average of about 22 months, you see where the constant increase in parole populations have come from, and then where the potential for what Jeremy was talking about, the churning of parolees in and out, this is in somewhat the culprit. The size of parolees growing, and then the fact that they all go on parole. DJS reports that at 3 years, 66% of all California prisoners released are back in California prisons. That's also nearly twice as high as the national average. And if you look even at more deep, 65% of all California prison commitments come from parole violations, either for new crimes or technical violations. So we knew that the culprit of the prison crowding situation was at least partly due to the way in which we handle parolees when they're out on the street and the percent of people that we put on parolees to begin with. So we knew at the time that addressing California's prison crisis had to address our state's parole practices. And as a side note, I still think that that is exactly the case we find ourselves in today, even more so. That addressing California's prison crisis today has got to address parole practices. We are facing, as probably you've seen in the news, massive release, a state budget that's out of control, and actually parole practices are being looked at very, very seriously, as Tom will describe later in his presentation, about how California has used the results of our studies and some other studies that they've done internally. Now, I want to now get to what the study really attempted to do that was unique. I have always felt, and many researchers before me, have looked at parole outcomes and violations. And for the most part, we conceptualized parolee outcomes as more complicated than researchers had done previously. Our conceptual framework, if you will, had to do with these 4 different clusters of factors. And if you see in the middle, what we were trying to predict was parolee outcomes, both violations and then response to violations, which we label as revocations. So the outcome we were interested in was parolee violations and how the courts and the parole agents dealt with them to return people to prison. Now, in the past, researchers have looked at parolee outcomes simply as a function of parolee background characteristics, the age, the race, the prior criminal record, and looked simply at the relationship between the parolee's background and parolee outcomes. There are hundreds and hundreds of recidivism studies out there in the field where researchers have tried to simply predict recidivism using parolee background characteristics. I've always felt, and in fact written probably 30 years ago, and have been writing it in probably every publication that I've written since, that that's simply too naive and simplistic. That we know that the community environment and the administration also is an important contributor to parolee outcomes. For example, let's take the left-hand circle, if you will, described as community environments. It imagines, and our hypothesis was, that certain differences in the community environment, such as reentry supports, the level of treatment available in the community, the level of poverty, the extent to which jobs exist in the community to which the parolee lives in, whether or not the political harshness, let's say, the voting patterns, all kinds of demographic and community variables are likely to relate also to parolee outcomes. We also envisioned that administration, how closely somebody was supervised, what the agent characteristics were, if they were male or female, whether or not they had come to their job from the institutions division or come from a social work background or from a criminal justice background, their age, their race, their characteristics would likely affect how they dealt with parolees and therefore would relate to those outcomes. We also thought that the formal policies, both at the agent level, how much discretion do they have, and also at the parole board level, what are the policies that they invoke when a parolee comes before them to decide who to incarcerate and who not to incarcerate, should predict outcomes. So as we began this study, our goal was really to try to capture variables on all 4 of these circles, if you will. And that's why this study, in fact, took us, I would say, probably over a year of concerted effort to actually collect data on all of this information to create this very, very huge data set. I'd like to take a moment to say that this was only possible because from the start, this project was seen as a collaborative venture between the research team, Ryken, myself, and eventually Jeff Lynn, and the administrative body at the CDCR, who allowed us to have complete access to all of their administrative data. It helped also because Ryken actually went and served as the director of research during the period when we were conducting the study, and I myself was a private consultant helping the reorganization. So not only was it a collaboration, but we were actually on the inside of this organization being able to access data that certainly I would have never been able to access before, mostly not because the department wasn't willing, but rather because I wouldn't have even known that those different data sets existed. And so I think this represents the only way this study was pulled off was because of that collaboration. And it was collaborative not only in the production of the data, but as you will see, in the utilization and working with us to think through what were the policy and research implications of what we had produced. Our goal, as I said, was applied in that sense, but it also was scientific. We wanted to conduct the most comprehensive, rigorous study of parole violations and revocations ever conducted. And it really was the case that I had the idea for the project, but I knew I didn't have the skills, the comprehensive data collection, methodological skills that Ryken Grattet represents on our project. I had the class background, I had the contacts, I had certainly the passion, but it was only when the two of us came together where we really were able to, I think, conduct a study that has much more rigor than has been applied to parole violations in the past. And then our goal was to use that knowledge base to improve California's parole practices. We had several things. One is that we wanted to see consistency in decision making. We looked initially at data and found that parole agents were dealing with parolees who looked very similar on paper, but they were dealing with them very dissimilar in practice. If you were arrested or violated in Los Angeles, you had a different probability of going to prison than if you were arrested for that same crime in San Diego, Fresno, or some of the other cities. So we wanted to show that inconsistency so that we could, in fact, create consistency. Our goal was cost effectiveness. We wanted to show corrections and delve into deeper how many parole violators. California violates 70,000 people a year for parole violations. How many of them really were nonviolent, non-serious, and could be handled elsewhere? That would impact the cost effectiveness of the parole system in our state. And of course, we wanted improved public safety. Again, we wanted to delve in deeper to the kinds of crimes and kind of events that were leading parole violators to both come to the attention of parole agents and then ultimately to the parole board. It's often been thought of that California sends nonviolent, non-serious, technical parole violators to prison, and that a lot of those are simply rule violators. We had seen data that suggested that maybe some of those technical violations, and in fact maybe a large percent of them, were actually new criminal events. We wanted to unpack that so that we could really get down to the basis about how many of those parole violators are truly serious and how many of them were truly technical and only had violated their rule infractions. I'd now like to turn it over to Ryken, who will talk more about the details of our study, what we found, and what we think the implications of our findings were.
Thanks a lot, Joan. I'm going to talk a little bit about the key findings of the report and try where I can to link them to some of the implications that we draw for policy changes. Any discussion of the California parole system really has to start with a consideration of its sheer size. In our study, we collected data on 254,000 parolees, which was any person who spent any time on parole during 2003, 2004. And at that time, and I think this is true today, there's about, at any given day, there's about 115,000 to 120,000 individuals on parole. And these individuals are supervised by a system with roughly 2,200 parole agents and 60 plus deputy commissioners who oversee parole revocation cases. So, this gives you a sense, I think, of the challenges that we face in California, just sort of from a human resources standpoint. We started this project thinking that the major focus of attention would be on how the system response to technical violations, but we soon learned that a good 2/3 of the reported violations in the system are for alleged criminal behavior, and the vast majority of those are the least serious criminal violations, which are the dark blue on the left, which consist primarily of drug use and drug possession violations. That doesn't mean that technical violations are insignificant. I think when we think of things like technical violations, we tend to think of things like failure to report, violating a special condition of parole, or traveling outside of one's permitted zone to be the major kinds of technical violations. In fact, we found that the vast majority of technicals are actually absconding violations, which are the blue on the right side of the right pie chart. So, this sort of is kind of the first sort of implication to draw here, is that if the system wants to make headway in reducing violations overall, then the biggest bang for the buck is going to be found by targeting the absconding and the least serious drug use and drug possession violations. Slide. A lot of what we did in the research is to look at the timing of violations, and here we found that risks really peak in the first 90 days. This is especially true for those drug use and absconding violations, and this suggests to us the importance of really concentrating evidence-based services and resources to the parolee in the first 3 months of their parole. And the curves also suggest that there may be some individuals, parolees, that having survived the first 6 months or so, really pose comparatively low risk to violate, and perhaps could be discharged from the parole rolls, or could be put on some kind of summary parole or parole light without a whole lot of threat to public safety. As Joan mentioned, we focused a lot of attention on the administration or the supervision impact on the risk of reporting violations, and one of the key findings in this regard is that the more intensively an individual is supervised, holding constant all of their other risk factors, the more likely they are reported to have violation. And I apologize for the complicated nature of this graph, but basically what these stair steps and the columns show is that for nearly every kind of violation, from the least to the most serious, parolees supervised at moderate and high levels of intensity are more likely to have reported violations. The effects of supervision are also greater on the less serious violations, which show some large differences between the moderate and high levels as well, and those are the ones on the left side of the chart. The implication is that parolees really need to be supervised appropriate to the risks that they pose to violate. Given finite resources, you want to make sure that you're not over-reporting on the minor bad behavior of individuals who really don't pose a great risk to public safety. And in California, the supervision levels and intensities are set primarily by the offense that a parolee has committed, rather than an assessment of their risk to reoffend. So there's a little bit of a mismatch there. Also, we know from past research that Joan and others have done, and this is something that Jeremy referenced, that higher intensity of supervision seems to have the best effects when it's coupled also with intensive service provision. Next slide. As Joan mentioned, we focused a lot on the revocation process as well, and one of the peculiar facts of life in California is that the existence of a long list of violations and types of parolees whose violations are subject to mandatory referral to the parole board. And here the parole agent and their supervisor really have no discretion in terms of how to respond to the parolee. California's mandatory referral policy, which is called the Robin Reagan rules, is something I hope we get a chance to go over a little bit more detail in the discussion. But here I simply want to show that the vast majority of cases that the parole board hears come from mandatory referrals. In fact, of the technical violation cases on the right that the board hears, an even greater percentage are mandatory. And so you might be asking yourself, well, why is the high level of mandatory referrals problematic? Well, if we go to the next slide, well, it's because most of the cases that the parole board hears wind up returning to prison. Again, even cases where the most serious offense is a technical offense, which is those on the right, an extraordinarily high number are returned to prison. And there's a couple of reasons why this may be. First, the safe move for a parole board official is just to return an offender to prison. When in doubt, reincarcerate. You don't want to go down as the deputy commissioner who allowed a parolee who had violated to go back on the street, and then they've done something horrible. So that's one reason. Another reason is that deputy commissioners may feel that it's better to reincarcerate somebody than send them back to a community where there are few services and supports for that offender to avoid the bad behavior that they're getting involved in. Thus, reincarcerating a parolee is seen as more desirable than continuing them on parole. And I haven't said a whole lot about this. That Joan mentioned that this kind of suggests that the community dimension is really important to this reentry process, and indicates that sort of some development of stronger support networks and services, evidence-based services, is really crucial. And then just to the last slide there. There's, of course, many policy implications that derive from the research that we discuss in much greater detail in the report, but I've just listed a handful here that perhaps we can discuss. But with my limited time, I just want to focus really on one of these. I would argue that the most important of the recommendations, and the one that in some ways really represents a paradigmatic shift for the department, is the parole violations and decision-making instrument that Tom is actually going to talk about. Based on our research, I think the parole violation matrix looks like a very promising tool, and there are three reasons for this. First, it begins to shift our system from an offense-based system to a risk-based system. And as I said previously, we've constructed an offense-based system which attends mostly to the commitment offense and the prior offenses that a parolee has engaged in, and we pay less attention to the actual risks that they pose. And the two are often not all that similar. The second reason is that it potentially provides a means for further developing intermediate sanctions and services for parolees. There are programs that parole violators can be placed in rather than returned to prison. And the tool that Tom's going to talk about actually, I think, provides a venue for stimulating the growth in those kinds of options for parolees. And then finally, I think it provides the means of standardized the treatment of parolees across the different parts of the state, as Joan said, but also, I think even more importantly, across the parole system and the parole board, which frequently operate with a lack of consensus about how to respond to parole violators. So each of these issues I've got listed on this slide are important issues for the system, and they're things that I think we can go into in the discussion today. So with that, I guess I can turn it over to Tom.
Let me just interrupt if I could. This is Jeremy Travis again. Yeah. Thank you, Ryken. Very helpful, and I apologize for mispronouncing your last name, Grattet, before. Just for those who have just joined us, we are about to hear from Tom Hoffman, who's the Director of Division of Adult Parole Operations for the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, who will offer his perspective on the research and the policy and practical implications for the department. And I also would like to remind those participating in the webinar that we encourage you to use the Q&A button on your screen to start sending in some questions so that we can get your reactions to this presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tom.
Well, good morning, and thank you for organizing this, and certainly we are all flattered that so many people have an interest in what we're doing. As Joan and Ryken have indicated, we're certainly not on a short list of issues we needed to deal with in California parole. To put it into some kind of context, we respond to about 170,000 violations a year across our division. And as the previous presenter said, we have about 2,200 agents and supervisors responsible for adjudicating those violations. Our system is unique on a number of fronts, as folks have indicated. We're a determinate sentencing state, so there are folks who are coming out of our institutions that conceivably are not ready to come out. We also have mandatory parole for everybody that comes out of our institutions. Keep in mind, we release about 10,000 people a month in the state of California onto parole supervision. We also are a system that has a significant influence and mandatory referrals to the Board of Prison Hearings and parole hearings, And of the 180,000 violations that come to our attention each year, about half of them are mandatorily referred to the board for adjudication. And at the moment, about 80% of the people that go to the board are returned to the institutions. Currently, the average term actually behind our gates for a parole violator in our state is about 3.6 months. It takes almost that entire period just to go through the reception center process and then to return that person back out to parole. So we're, as has been described, churning people through our system. The system has been, certainly over the last 2 or 3 decades, entirely focused on supervision and basically a punitive response largely to violations of the terms and conditions of parole and or the commission of a new crime by a parolee. And so when the many great outcomes of this study, it sparked a system-wide discussion between ourselves and our shared stakeholders, community leaders, local law enforcement folks inside our capital, that under an umbrella that says we are wanting to develop policy-driven responses to revocations and the commissions of new crime by our parolee population, and move the decision-making model away from one that has been largely offense-based. If parolee was his commitment of it was X, and he or she committed a violation Y, then Z is what happened. It was a pretty straightforward, most of the time, outcome. Keep in mind also that our capacity to develop and place programs in communities are controlled by communities. We contract, like just virtually every other state, with private vendors largely to provide those services. And if communities don't allow the vendor in with use permits and so forth, we are unable then to cite programming in communities. That discussion has taken on a new and more robust tone over the last 3 years or so, in part because of the budget issue, in part because of the overcrowding, in part because there's 22 different class action lawsuits against the CDCR and our system, and in part because of a real focus on the need to reform parole. And so now we're seeing some change in the way communities are responding to us. In the midst of meeting those challenges, it was then imperative in our judgment to develop structure and continuity and parity in the decision-making process. I guess I could go to this next slide here. And there, as a consequence of this study and with the help of the Center for Effective Public Policy, we undertook a process to develop what we now call the Parole Violation Decision-Making Instrument. And that instrument is intended to bring structure and continuity to the decisions that are made at the unit level. Over the last 18 months, almost 2 years now, we have worked with the center and with Joan Petersilia and her team to develop an instrument that brings together the tools and the science behind the behavior of our parolee population I think that we're blessed in that we have perhaps the most studied and researched parolee population in the nation. We are in a position, I believe, uniquely so, to, with some degree of scientific validity and support, make some pretty sound decisions about what the risk level of our parolees are by using the PDVMI and the California Static Risk Assessment. And so, as an example, in this next slide, what we're attempting to do in our tool, obviously, is blend and consider the risk that the parolee represents based on his or her criminal history and age and all the dynamics that would go into the risk assessment, and consider that in relationship to the severity of the instant violation. And then, and I don't pretend to understand the algorithms and so forth behind the tool, but then the tool is able to compute what level of risk that behavior with that parolee represents for violent recidivism. And then it guides the agent through a process that also includes the severity of the violation, and that's just this slide 6, where all of our violations are rated for severity in 2 different ways. We rate them for severity as it relates to the Department of Justice crime severity ratings, and we also consider the sentencing guidelines that are in place with the Board of Parole hearings. And so using those 2 in-place systems as a baseline for consideration, we then developed a severity rating for every one of our violations. So the PDVMI then uses the risk that the parolee represents, the risk of the instant violation, and guides the agent and supervisors towards a response that is proportionate and consistent. I'll go here to the construction of the CSRA, the California Static Risk Assessment. And you can see here that working with our CDCR Office of Research and the UCI Center for Evidence-Based Corrections, with input from the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, we worked to develop a tool that was based on and validated on a population of about 103,000 parolees that came through our system in 2002 and 2003. That tool and the research connected with it was completed and put into place in early 2008, and we are now using that score as part of what we consider in the PDVMI. So the parole violation instrument is further supported, I guess is a nice way to put it, by the information and the risk ratings in the CSRA. We also use a tool I think most of us are familiar with called the Static 99 that evaluates the risk for male sexual offenders. That's embedded in our tool. And so we're through an assortment of efforts trying to bring science and research and evidence-based practices to a system that had historically been entirely risk or offense-based and subjective. We now have the PDVMI in the field. We're rolling it out across our division. We currently have about 70% of our agents trained and using the tool, and so far we're very pleased with the results. Our agents are agreeing with the tool about 2/3 of the time. When they disagree, they mitigate about 15% of the time and aggravate about 15% of the time. We're also finding that one of the outcomes, and we anticipated this, is often the tool is overwritten because the recommended programming is not available in the community. And this is a problem that will take, in my judgment, years to rectify, especially now that we have the economic issues in our feed into that problem, but also the continued efforts by
Did we just lose people there?
Yes, it all just went. Now you're back, but
Yeah,
I'm here.
I can hear you, but I can't hear.
all of a sudden Tom went off.
Yeah.
This is Jim Coney. I'm just gonna do a quick roll again. So, was that Tom Hoffman? Was that Are you still there?
Lost Tom.
Yeah.
Okay.
Jeremy's here.
I'm here.
Peggy's here.
Right.
Okay.
Ryken's here.
Jeremy, I leave it to you what to do next. Maybe you can just go to Peggy, and if Tom has more, you can add.
I think go to Peggy, and if Tom is back, we'll get him in the Q&A.
Great.
So we next, sorry for the technological glitch, but we next hear from Peggy Burke, who's the principal in the Center for Effective Public Policy. Peggy. Mike?
Thank you, Jeremy. Are we going to get my slides up there, or do I have to give Tom's presentation? Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for moderating, and to NIJ for sponsoring this, and to my fellow panelists for all the work that they've done. Fascinating information on the research in California, as well as the work that CDCR has been doing. At the Center for Effective Public Policy, we had the privilege of working with CDCR as they were beginning and undertaking the restructuring of their practice around violations. And the reason we were asked to work with them is because we have, over the years, beginning in the early 1990s, sponsored primarily by the National Institute of Corrections, been working with parole agencies around the country on this issue. Now, it's interesting because for a very long time, there was not much focus upon parole violations, very little attention or visibility, very little policy directing what parole agents might do, or stating what a parole board might do in response to violations. Great deal of discretion on the part of parole officers, and largely invisible discretion. And the general approach was to monitor offenders, and that when the parole officer thought it was appropriate, to bring a violator back to the board. When we first started doing work in this area, I can remember, looking through the policy guidance and whatever, and typical language was that a parole officer will file a violation report when there is a violation, quote, in a significant respect. And so this sort of left much of this up to the discretion of the parole officer. Unlike California, where they are required to bring certain violations by certain types of offenders back to the board, and you saw Joan and Ryken describing that, most states there's a great deal of discretion on the part of the line parole officer. And as we've worked with jurisdictions around the country, it's been clear that there's a great deal of variability from one officer to the other, one supervisor to another, one region of a state to another. And of course, that was one of the first concerns that began to get attention even in the 1990s on this topic, because there was a concern that there was a great deal of variability and inconsistency. Of course, the other issue that has begun to bring attention to this is the growth in prison populations. We talked about a fourfold increase in prison population, and when you look at the parole population itself, who are at risk of violation and revocation, between 1980 and 2000, that population grew from 200,000 to over 630,000 just on state parole. And so the possible population to be revoked has also been growing dramatically. This is also a time, and I believe one of the other presenters alluded to this earlier, is that we became much, much better and more focused on surveillance during this period, with increasing ability and requirements for drug testing, electronic monitoring, GPS. Intensive supervision became very popular. And we know from the research now that just watching offenders and surveilling them does not change behavior, but it does surface and find a great deal of failure. And so at a time when our populations were growing dramatically, we also were getting much better at watching and surveilling, and our technology was improving, and we were very focused upon risk and being tough. And so it is not surprising, perhaps, in many ways, that we would have seen this dramatic increase in revocations and returns to prison. This chart that you're seeing here is just a graphic presentation of the increasing numbers of releases from federal and state prisons, and because, of course, we had growing populations and virtually everyone is released. And you also see that the accompanying increase in the offenders reincarcerated for violating parole or other release conditions. However, as I said, even as early as the 90s, we began to see a greater focus on this whole issue of responding to violations. Some of it grew out of the work that NIC was sponsoring with parole boards in an attempt to help them to develop more structured approaches to release decision-making and the use of decision-making tools, risk assessment, and the like. And so paroling authorities began to question, well, if we should have good structured decision-making policy about our release decisions, then certainly we should have them about our revocation decisions as well. And at that point, of course, there was a focus on consistency, as I said earlier, and the use of intermediate sanctions or responses for violations. I think there was a decision early on as we began focusing on this that not every violation is alike, and that certainly some of them, serious violations that pose risk to the community, would warrant revocation, swift revocation, but that other violations of a less serious nature and less risk to the community might well be candidates for intermediate kinds of responses, in the same way that we were at the time considering intermediate sanctions at the sentencing stage. And so parole agencies and paroling authorities began to develop objective scales to assess the severity of violations so that we could do it more consistently and more clearly, and the objective scales to assess risk, and using the empirically based risk assessment tools that were becoming more common and more reliable in that period. But again, the responses were mostly about consistency and proportionality and around holding offenders accountable according to the severity of the violation, but also incapacitating offenders based on the level of risk, so that we want to sort of control the risk based on the particular offender involved. And today, as we see in that, the very impressive information provided on California, the trend is towards more evidence-based violation decision-making, not just around consistency, although that is important, but also, and not just around incapacitating or containing the risk that offenders represent, but to reduce the risk that offenders may pose by using interventions in the community that respond to the level of risk and the criminogenic need that offenders represent. And so the goal in the work that we see going on today, I believe, is to really reduce the likelihood of reoffending, not only to contain the risk, and to reduce it not just by putting somebody in prison, but by using interventions and responses that address the specific criminogenic need that is going on. So we have worked with jurisdictions over the years then to use violations as opportunities to hold offenders accountable, but also to intervene with, according to the risk level, to reduce that, and to use the opportunity as a coaching occasion, if you will, to work with offenders to help them ultimately be more successful on supervision. And using and developing tools such as the PDVMI in California, which is, I think someone has called it the next generation of the violation matrix, and I would agree with that because it does incorporate different dimensions. And I hope we get a chance to talk about some of the lessons that have emerged from the work in California that CDCR has done, and also that the Center has worked with other jurisdictions on, about how jurisdictions can move in this direction to deal more effectively with their with violations and revocations. So I will, with that, and I know we've taken too much more time on presentations than we had anticipated, I'm going to throw it back to Jeremy and hope that we can get into some of the other topics as a response to questions and answers, or questions from the participants.
Great. Thank you so much, Peggy. And we want to make sure that Tom Hoffman's back with us. You there?
I am, Jeremy. Sorry for the technical difficulties.
That's okay. You went out in a blaze of static glory. didn't know quite what happened. Tom, I think rather than get back to your presentation, what I'd like to do is throw the first questions to you. We have a number of questions coming in from our participants that cluster around the curiosity, I guess, about how these changes are influencing practice within your agency. And let me pose two questions. One is, as you're getting to the point of sort of almost a complete rollout of the PVDMI, are you able at this point to project any changes in decision making in terms of reductions and returns to prison, which I think is the most sort of basic measure? And secondly, how have you gone about training not only agents but the people who are adjudicating the parole violation cases in the use of these new tools?
I'll ask the first question. We are tracking our results through the CDCR Office of Research, and revocations are down all across our system. In some instances, they're down in units that aren't using the PDVMI. One of the things that's underway across our system is this whole cultural shift about what it is we're trying to achieve and how we're going to manage our population. PDVMI and the risk assessment obviously facilitates that, but our revocations are down, and I don't have that percentage right off the top of my head, so I don't want to quote it, but I can certainly get that for folks. We are seeing the kind of results that we want, with the caveat. California does not have a particularly robust infrastructure of programs at the community level. Candidly, there are still counties in our state, and there's 58 counties in our state, where there are no CDCR-funded programs for parolees. Wraps around to that discussion that we have with communities all across our state about the fact that the parolees are coming home and they are going to need services, and many of them have an assortment of behavioral problems, alcohol, drug addiction, all those things that we need. Communities are starting to embrace that, starting to allow our programs in, and that over time will certainly have a big impact. I wanted, and I said it might have been when I was cut off with the technical issues. The Board of Parole Hearings has been actively engaged in this discussion and in the development of the tool since the inception of the process in July of 2007. We are training the deputy commissioners concurrent with our agents. We are moving across our division in a very methodical way, training unit complexes virtually one at a time. We have a team that we've organized from the headquarters operation here in Sacramento, and we move into unit complexes week to week, providing hands-on training and then hands-on support while agents and deputy commissioners begin to use the tool. As Peggy said, we are blessed with one of the best IT sections or IT teams I think I've ever had the privilege of working with. Our tool is entirely automated. Literally every step of it can be tracked, every decision can be tracked, every referral, and for purposes of rollout, all the problems that we have are tracked, and then responses to those are coordinated through the regional administrative teams. I have some of my regional administrators on the call, and then through the headquarters operation where we have a team of people here at headquarters devoted full time to the training and implementation of the PDVMI and the evaluation of not only the PDVMI but the California Static Risk Assessment. And one other comment, it's important to know that the commitment to thoughtful, validated use of risk and needs assessment tools begins before our parolee population ever leaves our institutions. We have a validated process inside the institutions. There's 33 state institutions and about 45 fire camps in our state where inmates, as they move through the release process, complete what's called a compass. It's a risk and needs assessment tool, and that the findings of that instrument and the results of that evaluation are sent to the agent of record prior to the parolee being discharged, so that the case plan and the programming that's designed for the parolee is built consistent with this commitment to be evidence-based and research supported with a risk and needs evaluation as an integral part of how we build our response to each and every parolee that we supervise.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to put a couple questions together into a question to Joan and Ryken. One of the, at least for me and maybe for others, one of the most intriguing findings of your study really revealed the effects of the system of mandatory referrals, which I think could be identified using Joan's schematic as one of those policy arenas that affects the ultimate outcome in terms of parole revocations. So I'm wondering whether, as you've taken a look at these changes that are now rolling out throughout the state of California, whether you're seeing an openness to rethinking some of those mandatory referrals and how that system squares with the new system of risk assessment and guided discretion that's being developed.
Well, I'll take a stab at it, and then you jump in, Ryken. One of the things I think we learned in our study was the lack of discretion at the parole agent level. When we first started this, we thought there would be a lot of discretion, but as you saw from Ryken's chart, ours is a system that is driven by a rule-bound policy focus, and it was one of those policy variables that we looked at. I think all of us who are part of this kind of parole reform in California, Tom included, I think, are trying to get the state to rethink the viability and desirability of using so many mandatory reports to the board. These are known as the Robin Reagan rules, as Ryken said, and they're named after a murder victim. And so it's very political to try to get those Robin Reagan rules changed. But I think that through training of the parole board, I think we're chipping away at it, Jeremy. But I think it's going to be where science meets politics when we try to roll back some of those mandatory reports to the board.
This is Peggy. Could I throw in a comment here? Because I think one of the things that's very interesting is that before the PDVMI was put into place, when there was a mandatory report to the board, the parole officer would send it forward without a recommendation because it was like that's the purview of the board. Now what they do with the PDVMI is they send it forward with a recommendation as to how they think the case should be handled. And it's my understanding from our preliminary look at the pilot is that the Board of Parole Hearings is agreeing overwhelmingly with the recommendations of CDCR as the cases come forward. So even though the case is referred to the board, it in many cases may actually continue on parole. Mm-hmm. And so even with those mandatory things in place, we're seeing some changes which might even support some changes in those mandatory recommendations.
Ryken or Tom, does either of you want to add to this discussion about the mandatory referrals?
I think this is Tom. Joan characterizes it well. This is one of those holy grail regulations in our state. A very tragic set of facts that led to this regulation. Robin Reagan was the daughter of a man who was killed by a parolee in a robbery. That parolee had been stopped by local law enforcement a few weeks prior to the homicide. There was a gun and dope in the car. He was not violated. We couldn't, at the time, this is a 1994 event, they couldn't tie the dope or the gun to the parolee. And so here you go 3 or 4 weeks later, a month later, the parolee kills William Reagan. And so any suggestion to change the mandatory referrals is met with significant resistance inside the Capitol. I think it's also important to agree with Joan and others that with the addition of the static risk assessment and PDVMI, the input of the expert panel relative to evidence-based practices and all that goes with that, now there is substantive discussions underway about if we were going to modify it, that's 2616 of the California regs, what would that look like? In my judgment, it is one of the more important long-term need or fixes that needs to happen for parole reform in the state of California.
Ryken, any additional comments on this?
Yeah, I was just gonna add that I think that one of the things that's different now than the 2003-2004 period in which we studied was that in some ways what we're seeing with the PVDMI is sort of the eclipsing of the impact of those rules, which used to be that as I said in my presentation, that once a case got its way mandatorily referred into the parole board, that 80 to 85% of the time the individual is going to go back to prison, and the parole agent and their supervisor and Tom's whole side of the house really had very little input or discretion to wield in those kinds of cases. And what's happened as a result of the PVDMI, and which is why I characterize it as sort of a paradigmatic shift for the department, is that now it permits a level of correspondence and communication between the parole division and the parole board that I think is really making a big, meaningful difference in the way that the department responds to violations and revocations. And I think a lot of the credit for that goes to Tom and his group, who have been able to sort of to actually bring this thing to life.
This is Tom again. I might add, I think, in my judgment, one of the most important beneficial outcomes of the PDVMI and the California Static Risk Assessment is that for the first time, our system has policy, written policy and administrative structure to the response of violations and commissions of new crimes by this population. Historically, that wasn't the case. Agents were allowed to make decisions on their own, for lack of a more thoughtful way to say that, and then the deputy commissioners, and there can be sometimes in excess of 90 of those folks across our state, human beings that are also making those decisions with little written definitive policy about the desired or the recommended response. And so people all across both systems erred on the side of personal security. And the safest thing to do, safest thing for them as an individual and the system, generally speaking, is to put folks back into custody. And so now, for the first time, there's a very structured, policy-driven system in place, helping and supporting people make what are really difficult decisions, understanding that there have been instances where agents make decisions, this is in our history, and when the parolee then subsequently does something stupid, agents were personally held accountable for how that happened. And you can imagine how that stifled the system.
Well, this is part of a larger discussion of the balance between discretion and mandatory decisions by government employees. I want to just shift gears, if I could. We've had some questions from our webinar participants about the availability of community-based services, questions about the phenomenon of absconding, which loomed large in Ryken's presentation as a basis for violations, and generally about the development of alternatives. Restorative justice has been asked. Someone asked about restorative justice. Someone else asked about training in mediation. Another one asked about training in meditation, as seen in some systems in India. So is there a component to the California reform agenda that is trying to engage community capacity and think about different ways of responding to the sort of the presenting conditions at the community level.
This is Tom. Yes, it's a huge piece of what we're devoted to here, and the education of communities about the realities of reentry has been something that certainly in the last 3 years has taken up a great deal of my time. We were, I'll use the word blessed, in that in 2006 the voters approved Jessica's Law, the sexual offender supervision laws, and that, I think, in my judgment anyway, has provided a real-life example of the implications of returning parolees to communities, given the high-profile nature of that discussion. And through that, we're also able to bridge the discussion beyond the implications of the sexual offender population returning to communities to the more complicated discussion about parolees in general returning to communities. Just as one example, LA County, one of the most populated county in our state, has about 34,000 parolees under our supervision at any given moment. And that's a community that historically has been very conservative and difficult for us to cite services, and now over the last 3 years we're actually able to get more and more of our service providers permits and so forth so that we can build the infrastructure. It's going to be a difficult and long discussion to get communities all across our state to embrace the responsibilities that are inherently theirs at a community level.
Joan, I wonder if you would also comment on this. You in your very helpful schematic with the 3 different sectors of influence here listed community factors and reentry services as an important component in thinking about how to understand violations and revocations. Is this something that where you see some change underway in California?
Well, one of the things that we didn't have a chance to go into all the findings, and I refer anybody who's interested in the findings to look at this month's Federal Probation or this month's Perspective magazine, both of which have summary articles from our study. And you'll see that one of the factors that we go over there is the finding, which I find very important for those of people like ourselves who want to encourage reentry support. Controlling for all other factors, the background, the administration, etc., we did find that the existence of community supports, meaning more programs, were related to less violations and less prison returns. So I think that finding in and of itself provides support for people who say nothing works. In fact, we did find when there were greater supports in the community, fewer people were returned. And in fact, another study that I've just participated in shows that when those services were within 20 miles of the parolee, revocations were lower, which means they could access those services. It wasn't just that they exist, but they could access them. So I think that finding is important, and I think that we were so on the road, Jeremy, and people listening, to getting this thing right. There was so much momentum here in California for the static risk assessment, the parole violation matrix. I'm participating in a couple of community partnership efforts, which were showing great promise until the economy kind of went south. And so now I think we're still struggling ahead, like every state, I'm assuming, in the country. Whether or not our momentum continues in the same way that I was excited about, I think we're all hoping that it will. But I think, like Tom said, we're having some significant challenges just here with the budgets. But the evidence is there about the importance of community support.
So certainly, even though California may be an extremist, the financial situation is certainly dire in every state around the country. So the availability of services, particularly services for poor people, much less people involved in the criminal justice system, are very much at risk these days. So it's encouraging, Joan, to hear that finding, and that's a good point of advocacy for those who want to argue for more services, but you're right to be discouraged about the availability of state governments to actually make those investments these days.
Well, I'd like to make a comment. The other thing that that we have seen as we've worked with states on this issue is that very important to bring stakeholders to the table as the policy is developed and as the realization of the need for services in the community becomes more apparent and more attached to the issue of community safety. And I think it does give an opportunity and an incentive and some momentum to bringing stakeholders to the table who may have access to services, even other funding streams beyond what the corrections itself can fund. And so I think this whole effort in this area provides an opportunity for bringing other resources to the table.
And in a larger sense, the savings that we expect will come out of these reforms in California, if all goes well, could be reinvested in some of those local services to continue to keep people in communities rather than sending them back to prison.
Right.
Yes.
Let me just, I asked sort of in passing about the finding about absconding in your study, and Ryken, this is something that came out of your presentation. I wonder if you just could elaborate upon that a bit more. I'm not sure, I didn't understand it, maybe others didn't quite understand how the absconding violations are adjudicated, and whether you're telling us that a lot of those ended up in returns to prison for absconding. Could you just help us understand that a bit more?
Sure. Well, it is the case that absconders are routinely returned to custody. The amount of absconding, it really is the major point I was trying to make is that when we think of technical violations, I'm not sure we immediately tend to think of absconding, but they make up the vast majority of them, and in some ways this is a research finding that calls out for more work. We need to understand why, whether or not absconding violations are being rendered when a parolee fails to show up for a couple of appointments, or whether they're not found for a couple of weeks in some cases. And just exactly how agents are using them. Are they using them as a sort of catch-all when they're suspicious that something else is going on, or is there some consistency in the application of that violation? Clearly there's a lot of instances where absconders, you abscond from parole often because you're using drugs or getting involved in criminal activity that you don't want to be detected for. So absconding can be a smoke where there may be some fire, but that's a research finding that in some ways calls out for more work and more detailed work than we were able to provide in our general bird's eye level kind of study, and it's a topic I've been bugging Tom about in recent months.
Peggy, I wonder from a national perspective, were you struck by that finding in California, and how do other states handle the absconders?
Well, I think that there's very, very mixed practice is the reality, and that not all absconding is alike. As Ryken said, it may be the case that someone has missed an appointment or two. That could be a definition of absconding. Others have gone for long periods of time and involved in serious kinds of activities. I think that it's important to, as jurisdictions are trying to build a better policy-driven responses to violations, to begin to sort out what's actually going on in their jurisdiction. I mean, one of the things that is also comes to the fore as we're discussing this is what is the posture and method that parole officers use in interacting with offenders. And it may be in some jurisdictions where there is the feeling is, I missed an appointment and I know I'm going to have a dirty urine when I go in, so I'm not going to the parole office. And so they're actually policies and practices are kind of driving people away, if you will. Whereas other jurisdictions where they may say, we'll work with you if you're having problems, or if you're having problems with paying your fees or whatever, come in, see us, work with us, and we can try and get you back on the right track. And so I think it unpacks a whole set of issues about how you're really supervising and how you're interacting with offenders to help them be successful versus, and accountable as well, versus maybe having practices in place that may discourage them and negatively impact their motivation for successful cooperation with the supervision process.
Thanks. Tom, Ryken said he's been imploring you to take a closer look at absconding, and I just wonder how, when you saw those data presented for the first time, whether it caused any thoughts in terms of how you want to handle this behavior differently and how it fits within the new world of the PVDMI?
Well, yes. Obviously, it's when in 2006 we had about 20,000 of our parolees labeled as PALs, about 1 in 5, 1 in 6 as a PAL, and that was one of the first things that struck me as problematic. As Peggy was saying, there's like so many things in this business. There's no one thing that fixes it. Part of it's cultural. Part of it is the mandatory referrals. Part of it's the response at the board. Part of it is community apprehension. Part of it is the way we interact with our parolees and our real strong focus on supervision and sort of the punitive response to violations. And over the last 3 years, we've worked hard on virtually every piece of that puzzle. And as we sit here today, we have about 15,000 parolees are reported as PALs, and that number is falling virtually every month. We have developed a new team all across our division for the pursuit of high control PALs, folks who are in a service classification status that is more strict than some other populations. We're finding literally hundreds of folks every month through that effort, and I'm confident that using what we've learned in this study, and I think perhaps even more importantly, a cultural shift in the way we supervise and the way we respond to violations and our capacity to provide alternatives for our parolee population, will continue to see these numbers fall. And it will never be zero, obviously, but certainly, we have a goal that we reflect, the national standard, which in my mind, I think I've got a percentage of something around maybe 7 or 8% or so of parolees are historically seen as absconders.
And just a definitional question, how is California defining absconding? Peggy said there's variation across the country. What's the definition in California?
Well, the definition is that they've been unavailable for supervision for 30 days. But the reality is that can mean lots of things. It could mean, and this is one of the ways I think the PDVMI and just our cultural shift is working, it can mean that an agent's gone to the house twice to make contact with a parolee and has been unsuccessful. Mom hasn't seen him, or mom is being evasive, or however that goes. We all know those stories. And so if that happens, during the 30-day period, he's deemed to be unacceptable or uncooperative for supervision, unavailable, and he's reported as a PAL. And it can be that to, what we might see as a more strict interpretation of it, that there's been a whole litany list of concerted efforts to find and make contact with a parolee, and he really has made every effort to avoid us, and that person is PAL. So it's, again, there's a range of responses, but per code, it's unavailable for 30 days.
And just a final really technical question here for those of us not in your world. What does PAL stand for?
Parolee at large.
Okay. It was a little jarring to hear these referred to as PALs. quite what they meant. We have a number of questions about a risk assessment. And I wonder if we could return to that part of the reform initiative here. And what I gathered from Joan's presentation at the outset is that risk had been defined previously by crime of conviction, and that there's now been a movement towards a validated risk assessment instrument. And that's something of great interest to practitioners in the field, and how it's being implemented. I wonder if, I'm not sure who's best to answer this, maybe Tom, is just to give us a sense of how that risk assessment instrument was designed. He talked a lot about the training on the PVDMI, which I assume includes use of a risk assessment. You also said that the risk assessment process starts while, if I understood you correctly, while somebody's in custody. And I would like to link this, if we could come back to Joan and Ryken, about their very provocative finding about the relationship between time at risk and a time of violation, that the risk was not static. In fact, it was temporally defined, and that violations happened earlier on. So how do we think about risk being redefined in California? Can we start with you, Tom?
Well, sort of a complicated response to that. The risk being redefined is now bringing science and evidence and research into what had historically been what's more commonly referred to as a clinical judgment, aka the agent's gut feel about the risk that a parolee represents for violent recidivism. And now through the development of this California Static Risk Assessment, by the way, that tool was modeled after Dr. Bernowski's instrument that was developed in the state of Washington at the Washington Institute of Public Policy. Now that instrument was developed by our CDCR Office of Research and Dr. Petersilia's team, Susan Turner et al. At the Center for Evidence-Based Corrections. We validated that tool on the post-discharge behavior of about 103,000 parolees that were discharged in 02 and 03. And I'll let Dr. Petersilia talk about the science behind that and the methodology by which that tool was developed, and then we can, maybe Joan, after you do that, I can talk a bit about how we're using it.
Well, I think this was a classic recidivism prediction tool in that we took a sample of people that were released from custody, and we then, actually this was quite a big effort that Susan Turner really directed. We actually went to the Department of Justice and got state recidivism records for all the people that were released from CDCR. We coded in all of their recidivism events, and then we coded in their background characteristics, and we did a classic kind of recidivism prediction tool. It allowed us then to do what, as Tom mentioned, they'd been doing in Washington, to create different, in a way to say, you know, what's the amount of risk you're willing to take? What's the kind of recidivism you're willing to define recidivism by? So we took that data set, and we then looked at how many people violated for violence, how many people violated for property, what were the characteristics of those people, and we developed, in essence, a statistical profile. And then we took that information, and working in collaboration with our Department of Corrections and the legislature and a bunch of other folks that got involved with this, what would we classify as a low-risk person? What would we classify as moderate risk? You see that the three categories on the screen that really was developed after the tool was developed at UCI and given to the state. They then decided what they wanted to use as thresholds for defining low, moderate, and high risk. What made that different is the parallelism between that and our PVDMI. Only when we brought those two things together were we able to then have what we call kind of the next generation PVDMI, which is on the one hand the risk assessment, and on the other hand the severity of their current violation. So our risk assessment tool should be very similar to people who are, you know, listening in. It's just a classic risk assessment tool that's being used, I think, nationally. Tom, do you want to say more about that, how you've then used it in California?
Well, we're using it in a number of ways. As Joan indicated, the CSRA score is embedded in the parole violation decision-making instrument. It's one of actually two risk assessments that are embedded in that tool. It's this score and the static 99, the sexual offender risk score. And then secondarily, when we are considering, and of course these policy calls haven't been definitively made, but when there's discussions around if we were going to discharge a certain population of parolees because of the budgetary concerns and parole reform generally speaking, what would that population look like? The CSRA has been embraced at the legislative groups as a valuable tool in making those kinds of decisions, and so we're pleased to see that because we have now developed really excellent predictive instruments that are validated, we're able to then carry debates inside the political and social environments that we need to that have seems to be more credibility and more likelihood that reform of some kind will be embraced and supported by folks who had historically been very hesitant to agree to any of that. Because now, instead of it just being decisions that human beings are making on their own, and not that that's all bad, clinical judgment has been shown to be right about 50% of the time. When you take good, well-trained agents and overlay their judgment with validated risk assessment tools, you bring the baseline accuracy level up to around 70% or so. It can get a little higher than that at times. That resonates well, and so of the many benefits of having this infrastructure in place is the capacity to carry arguments and make proposals with a whole different tone to them.
This is a good chance then for us to loop back to Ryken, and Joan, if you want to add to it as well. But Ryken, in your presentation, you talked about the relationship between time at risk, somebody being released from prison and placed on parole supervision, and violations of that supervision, basically showing that the vast majority of violations occurred within the first 90 days, and suggesting as one of your policy implications that perhaps at some point people could be placed on supervision light or paper supervision or even discharged from parole. So how does this different way of thinking about risk play into the notion of static risk and how supervision should be managed differently?
I guess the main thing is that the system already has a mechanism in it to bump people down who perform better on parole, and so you can, after 6 months, move down from a high level of supervision to a lower level of supervision, and that does happen. This evidence sort of provides stimulation for more readily using that option. The state also has an administrative rule, policy rule, that you can be discharged after a year on parole, if you remain violation-free and otherwise well-behaved. But in practice, that option is very seldom used, especially during the time period that we were studying. Maybe used a little bit more now, but it seems to me that our research and that particular finding about time dependence really suggests that that surviving through that period then separates you out from the other individuals who have already committed violations and perhaps been returned to custody even. So, yeah.
Joan, a final word on this, and then I want to step back and look at this from a national perspective.
Well, I think that the fact that we now have the California Static Risk Assessment combined with the results of our study, which show that people fail quickly or they don't fail at all. If you took the low risk, nonviolent, non-serious, and allow them to get off parole at 3-6 months versus 12-18 months, it, from our research and from research in addition to this study, that would represent very low public safety risk. And it's certainly one of our major recommendations to the state. Both Tom and I have made it, is that there is a group of parolees now on parole that we have the science to discharge earlier than we currently are, and it has to do with that, kind of time to failure results.
So we have about 10 minutes left in our webinar, and I want to end where we began, which is talking about the national framework within which we're considering the California study. And I'm going to pose a question first to Peggy, and then ask our California colleagues to respond as well. Peggy, in Joan's opening setup to the California study, she said that California was both representative and not representative of parole practices in the country, throughout the country, and painted a picture of a system that's seriously overcrowded, facing judicial oversight and early release decisions in a state that is in financial crisis. And that's certainly an extreme picture, but not one that is too far removed from what's happening in a number of states. Joan also said in her slide that had the word "the culprit" on the top, that one of the contributors to the state of affairs was the very high level of parole revocations in California, and gave us this statistic, that the Bureau of Justice Statistics reports that at 3 years, 2/3, 66% of the prisoners are back in California prisons, but that is nearly twice as high as the national average. So Joan is certainly right. She's identified a culprit, and I'll ask her in a second to make some predictions as to whether that number will come down. But I wondered, first of all, from your perspective, Peggy, whether you think that this is an area where significant change is possible, both in California and throughout the country, in reducing the number of individuals returned to prison for parole violations.
I think it's absolutely a very promising observation, and for this reason. It is clear that the phenomenon that we are observing around violations and revocations are the creatures of deliberate or not so deliberate policies and choices that states make. And I think that the good side of that is that with some focus and with a clear idea of what a state wants to accomplish and a good analysis of the dynamics and the information and what have you, that it's possible to make very deliberate changes in practice that will result in fewer failures, fewer returns to prison, and with no appreciable change in community safety. And we've certainly seen that in other states. And I think that California has many of the same kinds of pressures going on: growth, more punitive approach, less discretion in the hands of some decision makers. But much of that exists in many states, just not quite so extreme. After all, California is one of the largest, is the 7th largest economy in the world, or something like that. So it is, the system is just bigger than virtually any other. So, but I think it's very promising, because I think with deliberate actions around shaping our policy and bringing the stakeholders to the table and articulating what our goals are more clearly, which is successful completion of parole and the protection of the community, that we can, and we have seen states where this has, where there's been measurable success in this area.
So let me ask our California colleagues whether, if we were on a webinar 5 years from now, talking to each other and with people from around the country listening in again, and we were presenting some data similar to the data that Joan presented at the outset here from BJS, that shows that at current rates, 2/3 of the prisoners released from California are back in the California prison system within 3 years, twice the national average. Where do you think California will be in 5 years? Joan, do you want to
Well,
start
I'll take that. I'll take that crystal ball, Jeremy, because I actually think there is no way we are not going to change this situation. I think Peggy hit on it. It was a deliberate policy choice to treat parole violators in the punitive fashion that California has, which is the hope, because it can be a deliberate policy choice to now treat them differently. And we are seeing all over the state, not just because of the PVDMI, but all over the state, a reluctance to send non-serious, non-violent parole violators back to prison. And it's not because the state has all of a sudden gone soft. It is because that they've realized the expense of those prison beds, and they don't want to use them for non-violent, non-serious, technical parole violators. And so I think if we were here 5 years from now, we will still see, we now send about 70,000 parolees back to prison each year. I think that number will probably go to 40 to 50,000. It's not going to be, I think what we'll do is we will cull out the true technical violators, and we will punish them with intermediate or remedial sanctions.
Thanks, Joan.
I
Tom, you're a public official, so we don't hold you to this is not your personal outcome measure here, but what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I agree with Joan. I think for lots of reasons, many of them very good, many of them political and financial, the system simply has to change. And there is, in my judgment, just in the 3 years I've been blessed enough to be the parole director, a significant shift in the tone of the discussion all across our state at the local level, which is really where the long-term solution is. Obviously, we make policy calls, and we've deliberately made some, I think, really important calls with the development of a structured decision-making model and the risk assessment and risk and needs assessment inside the institution and a commitment towards evidence-based practices and all that goes with it. I think part and parcel because that we have, I think, the responsibility to lead this discussion and lead by an example of success. And I think the communities now are seeing that we are, for lack of a better way of saying it, modernizing our system, enhancing our commitment to research and evidence-based practices and practices that have been proven to be successful all across the nation. And so now the tone is changing. Put that on top of the economic realities, put that on top of federal class action lawsuits, put that on top of the reality that communities are shifting their orientation about putting low-level offenders into a $46,000 a year bed. I would agree with Joan that there will be a reduction in that number, and it won't be insignificant.
Ryken, you're going to get the final question before we sign off here. So these are remarkable predictions from your California colleague, and we haven't talked sufficiently perhaps about public safety here, other than to say that this has driven a number of the policy decisions in California concerned about public safety.
Yeah.
So if you were speaking to a group of citizens or elected officials in California and heard the prediction that the number of people returned to prison might go be cut by 40% or 30% over the next 5 years, and someone said, well, how's this going to affect public safety? What would you say?
Well, I would say that ideally that if we build build in some of these changes, that public safety will be enhanced. And the thing I worry about, while the budget crisis is a great opportunity to rethink the structural and policy kinds of aspects of our system, one of the things that I think is very much threatened by the budget crisis is the resources that are needed to develop infrastructure within communities. And that's where I fear, even if we succeed in lowering the return to prison, without building up the infrastructure in communities to actually really support reentry, I think may not necessarily make the public any safer. And that's the challenge: is to see the reform of the system through. It's not just about not sending people back to communities. It's also about really facilitating and making that reentry process more successful for a greater number of parolees.
Ryken, you got the final word, and talking about success both for parolees and for communities, I think is an appropriate place to end this conversation. I want to thank our panelists for a really first-rate, high-quality discussion about a very important and complicated issue, and particularly thank all three of our California colleagues for their contributions to what's now a landmark study on parole violations and revocations, and thank Peggy for her national perspective. I am informed by the folks running the webinar that questions that have been posted will be answered. Many of you asked questions about resources that are available and how to get copies of various instruments that have been designed and the PVDMI material, and we'll figure out how to get that to you and other materials in the resource section of the webinar. So thanks again to our colleagues at the Ash Institute and to the Kennedy School at NIJ, and thanks to the folks who have been listening in for their great questions and patience and for their concern about this issue and their desire to make things work better. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.